So we begin today the Gemara on Daf Nun Zayin with Beis, where it says Elo min hadod detanya. So the Gemara here is in the middle of a discussion of a question that Yishmael Ish Kfar Yama asked, and that is when you are planting something that doesn't rot in the ground. You take something, you plant a bulb, and it grows from it. For example, you're planting onions, garlic. So the question is, the additional growth that came out, is it mevatel? Does it nullify what you planted? So the relevance of this was regarding different halachas. Yishmael Ish Kfar Yama asked this question originally regarding Shemitah. If you're planting something that grew in Shemitah, onions that grew in Shemitah, so it's aser. All the halachas of Shemitah apply to it. But now, it continued growing after Shemitah in the 8th year, and when it grew in the 8th year, so there's additional gidulim that are enough to be mevatel that bulb that you planted in the ground. Will that additional gidulim be mevatel what you planted in the ground? That's the shaila. The Gemara tried to resolve this, and the Gemara did not come to a conclusion. It brought different Nedarim here that spoke about similar things. And okay, let's see. The Gemara here now brings a braisa. Element adod detanya. So we can resolve this question from the following braisa. Rab Shimon said, "Kol davar." On page daf noches now. Kol davar sheyesh lo matirin. Anything that is aser now, but it has a heter. You could be matir in the future. Kogain, tevel, for example, tevel, which is untithed produce. Right, so you can just take the maestris and then you matir it. Or meiser sheni, which is usually brought to Yerushalayim, or you can redeem it. Actually, you don't have to bring it itself to Yerushalayim. You redeem it with money. So then this produce would be mutter to eat outside Yerushalayim. The hektish, or hektish as well, could be redeemed. The chadash, or chadash, is anything that grows after the Korban Omer was brought in the Beis Hamikdash. So then you have to wait until the following year when they bring the Korban Omer on the second day of Pesach, and that's going to be matter this produce. So this is also something that has a heter in the future. So all of these things, lo nasnu behem chachamim shir. Chachamim didn't give any amount that could nullify this iser. Here, so this is the brayso that says the halacha that a davar sheyesh lo matirin is aser b'mashahu. Okay, and now the Ram points out, I'm not going to get into the whole arichas again, that this is only when we're talking about min b'minoi, meaning that it got mixed into something else which is the same min. Then I say that it will not be bottled, even if there's a mashu of isser that falls in, it'll be aser. But when you're talking about something which is min shaloi b'minoi, so then it still will be bottled, even though it's a davar sheyesh lo matirin. This was explained earlier on Daf Beis. Rab Shimon continues in this brayse here, v'chol davar she'ein lo matirin. If you're talking about all kinds of isurim that are aser and have no way to make them permitted, kogain truma is truma, and there's no way to change that. Or trumas meiser, which is another type of truma, which you have to from meiser itself. You have to also separate truma. Or v'chala is also something that has no heter. And the Ran actually points out an interesting thing is that the truth is meiser does have a heter. Chala that is. Chala does have a heter. When you separate chala, you could decide to change and I don't want this piece of dough to be chala. You can be shoyal on it. You can be mata this chala and exchange it for another piece to be chala. So why isn't it called a davar sheyesh lo matirin? So the Ran explains because a neder, you're able to be matir it. And the Gemara before said that that's called a davar sheyesh lo matirin. That's something that there's a mitzvah to be matir the neder. But over here regarding the challah, there's no mitzvah to exchange the challah from one piece of dough to another. So even though you could, but since there's no mitzvah to, so therefore this challah is considered to be something which is aser, without a heter. Or va'arla, the fruits that came from a tree in the years of arla, the first 3 years, a klaya kerem, something that grew, vegetables that grew in a vineyard, and it's klayim. So all these things are also forever. Nasnu behem chachamim shir. There's various different shiurim that chachamim gave to be matter them. If it gets mixed with something that's mutter, so sometimes it's bottled in 60. That's usually actually by min she'enim minoi, when it's something which is not its type, and you have to know if it has a taste from the iser. So that's usually when you have 60 times against it. Or regarding the arla klai kerem, has 200 times against it. It's different shiurim. By trum, it's 100 times against it. Okay, so that's the general rule that there is b'negeiah to bittul. There's a difference if it's a davar sheyesh lo matirin or it's a isser that has no heter. Okay, so now we come to the part that's relevant for us, b'negeiah to shmita. Amru lai, the chachamim asked Rab Shimon on this, v'haloi shvius. But when it comes to something that grows in shmita, ein la matirin, so it has no heter. It's a produce from shmita, and all the halachas of shmita will apply to it forever. V'loi nasnu ba chachamim shir. And nevertheless, chachamim did not give any shir. There's no amount of truma that you could say that, but there's a certain shir that if you have heter against it, it'll become bottle. By truma, by shvius, that is, even a mashahu of shvius will aser whatever it fell into, whatever it got mixed into. And the Gemara here interrupts with bringing a Mishnah to prove this point, and this is a Mishnah in Masechta Shvius that says, the Tanan, Hashvius Aiseres Kolshuhu B'mina. If you have something from Shemitah that is mixed with something which is mutter, so even a kolshu, even a tiny drop of something of Shemitah that gets mixed with something else that's mutter, if it's the same min, it's going to aser it. So you see over here that even though Shemitah is a davar she'ein loy matirin, something that's also forever, and nevertheless, it's even a mashu is going to make it aser. Why is it? Rab Shimon said the rule that if it's something that's aser, so Chachamim gave a shear that some percent, some amount, it's able to be mevatel the iser of this Shemitah. So why is Shemitah different? That's the question there. So Amar Lehen, Rab Shimon responds and explains, Afani loy amarti, I as well did not say. So this lashon of the Gemara is a little bit difficult to understand, because Rab Shimon is actually coming to explain the pshat of this Mishnah that we just quoted from Masechta Shvius. So if you look into the Ran, he's actually not goyres in the Gemara Afani loy amarti, but he's goyres af hein loy amru. They, the Chachamim in that Mishnah in Masechta Shvius, mean to say as follows. In other words, Rab Shimon is going to come and answer here, what's the pshat in this Mishnah of Masechta Shvius that you brought as a raya against me? So before I read the Gemara inside, the point that he's going to explain is, when it comes to Shemitah, there are two different stages in the foods and the produce of Shemitah. There's the produce of Shemitah before beer. There's halacha of beer, which means that if from this type of food that you have from Shemitah, if it's still available for the animals in the field to eat from it, so then you could keep it in your house and also eat from it. You have to eat from it properly the way Shemitah demands. You don't destroy it, you have to eat it, but it's still mutter to eat. You keep it in your home and eat it if the animals have out available in the field to eat from it. But if it's produce of Shemitah that is not available anymore for the animals in the field, so then that's called Zman Habir. Now you have to take it out from your house and you have to get rid of it. You have to destroy it and get rid of it. You're not allowed to eat it. So there's two time periods of Shemitah, which basically means that within the things that come from Shemitah, there is a time period where it's yesh loy matirin, meaning that it's taka Shemitah produce, but you can do something with it. You can eat it. You're not allowed to destroy it, you're not allowed to misuse it, but you can eat it. It's yesh loy matirin. And then after Biur, the produce of Shemitah becomes something which is totally aser, with no heter at all. Because after the time of Biur, you have to just get rid of it. So therefore, what he explains is, when the Mishnah here says that Shemitah will aser with a kol shuhu, so loy amarti, or as I said, the Ran is gairis, that loy omru, chachamim there in that Mishnah were saying, ela lebir. You're talking over there about the produce of Shemitah after the time, loy amarti ela lebir. Avol achila, yeah. So it's before the time when it has to be before the time that it has to be destroyed. Avol achila, again. Heim loy amru ela lebir. Af heim loy amru ela lebir. Again, according to the pshat of the Ran over here, that heim loy amru, that the Shemitah is going to aser with a kol shuhu. Gabi, what is it asa b'kol shuhu? That you're going to have to eat it before the time of the beer. That's Gabi what they said. Again, so the lashon of the Gemara here is ela lebir, meaning that it's before the time of the beer, and therefore you're going to have to eat it. So since you can eat it, so it's not considered to be something that's ein lo matirin. It has a heter. What's the heter? Go ahead and eat it. So if it got mixed into something else that's not Shemitah, so what's the problem? Why should it become nullified with a heter? Chacham didn't give any shear for this. So you have to just go ahead and eat it. But if this is something which is already after the time of biur, and then there's an iser of eating it, so achila means that it's usher for you to eat it. So over here, b'noisen tam. Over here, Chachamim said that there is going to be a certain shear in order for it to become mutter. And what's the shear? If it's a min b'sha'ein minai, so the shear is like always, that it's when it's 60 against the iser, b'noisen tam. Okay, so again, the point that he's saying over here is that if it's a time before beer, so then you're able to eat it, so then because it's a davar sheyesh lo matirin for you to be able to eat, so it's going to become aser. Even a mashu of the shmita is going to be aser. But if it's a time that the iser is the achila, you're not allowed to eat it anymore because it's already after the time of the beer, so then it's going to be aser b'kolshu. Then what? Then it's going to be mutter if you're going to be mevatel it, because it's already not a davar sheyesh lo matirin.
What's the iser by beer? I'm not getting that. Also kosher. He's allowed to eat it.
And a chanami, but you have to, one second, but you have to eat it with kedushas shmita. There's certain halachas of how you treat it. You must eat it. You can't destroy it. You can't use it for fuel or other things. There's certain, even before the zman habir, when you're allowed to eat the produce from shmita, there are certain halachas of how you eat it. So if it gets mixed into something else which is not shmita, so it's not going to become bottled. Everything else is you're going to have to treat like shmita itself, like the produce of shmita itself.
So when you say it's also so only in the time if it got
before it meat, what the Gemara means is before the beer, when you're allowed to eat it, and therefore it's considered to be a davar sheyesh lo matirin. That's what the Gemara means. Right? Elo beer meaning before the time of beer.
But this over there is that what?
You have to eat it with kedushas shmita. The fact that it has to be eaten with the proper halachas of kedushas shmita. Yes. Correct. Okay, now the raya of the Gemara over here is not so clear. So what's the Gemara bringing a raya regarding what we were speaking about? Over here we're talking about when you planted something and it grew out of it more than the issa that there was, right? The halacha that we spoke about, shmita. So what's the Gemara bringing a raya from over here from this? So the raya of the Gemara, the way that Ran explains is, when it says over here that from shmita, the lashon that he brought over here, the Gemara brought over here from the Mishnah, hashvius leiseres kolshu b'mina, that by shmita even a kolshu will aser. What does this mean? This means in two cases. This means whether you have a little bit of produce of shmita that gets mixed into other produce that's not from shmita, the regular kind of taruvis, when you have a mixture. So that little bit of shmita that's there that got mixed in will aser the whole thing, even a mashahu. But it also applies to the case that we were speaking about. If you have produce that's still growing in the field, and it's growing in the 6th year, and then it continued growing into the 7th year of Shemitah. And in the 7th year of Shemitah, it grew another mashu in Shemitah. That gidulin, that it grew, a mashu in the year of Shemitah, is going to aser the entire produce that grew in the 6th year. So I see that the gidulin that grows in the 7th year of Shemitah is going to aser what grew in the 6th year.
You can't use it at all.
And therefore you won't be able to use it at all, or you'll have to use it only with the kedusha of Shemitah. Okay, so therefore we see over here that what grows has the koyach to aser what grew from before. And I don't say that what grew is not something new. I don't say that what grew is not something new and therefore it has the same halacha as the heter of what it grew from. Okay, but the only thing is, let me just explain here a second. How does the Gemara know that this is what this Mishnah in Masechta Shvius is talking about? When it says in the Mishnah, the Hashvius, Eiseres, Kol Shu B'mina, how does it know that we're talking about not only when you have a little bit of Shemitah produce that gets mixed into a basket of a bunch of other produce that's not from Shemitah, but it's also talking about when something is still planted in the ground and it added in the growth. Kol Shehu means that it added in the growth. How does the Gemara know that? So it's not spelled out over here clearly, but the Mefarshim say that there's a raya over there from this Mishnah of Masechta Shvius, when it says Shvius, it said as Kol Shu B'mina, this is a repetition in that Mishnah, because it already said earlier in the Mishnah there, that rule that Shemitah asers with a Kol Shu. And because it repeats it a second time, the Gemara has a raya that it's talking even about the Gidulin of Shvius that asers the bulb of Shishis of the 6th year that was planted in the ground. Okay, but the only thing is, it's not 100% clear in the Gemara why it has to bring this entire hemshech of Rab Shimon and this whole thing about davar sheyesh lo matirin. Why did the Gemara not simply bring that Mishnah in Masechta Shvius? And over there, like I said, the main raya is from the repetition of that Mishnah Masechta Shvius instead of bringing this whole erichas of Rab Shimon. So in the pshat of the Gemara here, it's not clear. The Rishonim speak about this, but this is what the Gemara means to say, that in that Mishnah we see that Shemitah has a koyach to aser b'kol shehu, and that means not only by a mixture, but that means also by gidulin, also when it grows. So that shows that the gidul of the 7th year asers the bulb of the 6th year, and I don't consider the gidulin to be part of the heter of the bulb of the 6th year. So the Gemara answers, there's no raya from here to the case that Yishmael asked. What was the question of Yishmael before? If you remember, Yishmael asked a similar question, but he was talking about a reverse case. He was talking about something that grew in the year of Shemitah, and now it continued growing into the 8th year. And now the question is, what continued growing into the 8th year, whether that will be matter, the produce of Shemitah from the 7th year. Over here, we're bringing you a mission of Masechta Shvius that's talking about the reverse. Something that grew in the 6th year and it continues growing into the 7th year, that the giddel of the 7th year is going to aser what it grew in the 6th year. So therefore the Gemara answers, there's no raya from here. V'dilma, perhaps, honami l'chumre, over here as well. This is just a stringency. The fact that the giddel of the 7th year continued growing from the 6th into the 7th year, this is a stringency, and therefore we say that it's going to aser it. So this is different than before. So there's no raya from here. The Ran points out over here that the Gemara already gave the same answer in the previous daf when it tried to prove this point. And it's interesting that the Gemara tries to prove the same point again and it gives the very same answer. Why is the Gemara bringing it up a second time? So the Ran answers and says, because over here, there's actually a double chumrah. What's the double chumrah here? Number one, the chumrah that the giddel of the 7th year is going to aser the produce that began growing in the 6th year. And number two, there's the chumrah that Kaidim beer, this is a davar sheyeshle matirin, and therefore even with a mashahu, it's going to aser it. That's the second chumrah. This whole concept of davar sheyeshle matirin is a chumrah midrabanan, and that's a second chumrah that even a mashahu, it'll be bottle. It will not be bottled, that is. So therefore, the Gemara thought that maybe you can't say that there's two chumras midrabanan here. We're going to have to say that the halacha, that when it grows, it's going to aser, maybe that is a iser min atayr. It's not a chumra midrabanan, because it's difficult to say that chachamim in one case applied two chumras. The chumra that the giddel asers, even though in atayr it doesn't, and a second chumrah that even b'mashu will aser because of the davar sheyesh lematirin. So therefore over here there is a new chiddush that the Gemara is saying that hai nami l'chumrah shani, that we apply even with this double chumrah in this case, and lav dafke that min hatayre the giddel will aser. So therefore the Gemara brings from another case, ela min adah pashta. We're paishet this from the following Mishnah. This is another Mishnah in Masechta Shvius. The Tana the Mishnah there says, b'tzolim you have onions. And again, we're talking about produce that began growing in the 6th year and it grew into the 7th year. So, b'tzalim sheyardu aleim gishamim v'tzamchu. So these onions, they grew, and and it rained, and therefore they grew more. V'tzamchu. Now the question is, when you're looking at what grew over here, what are you seeing? Are you seeing these leaves that grew from these onions? Are they from the 6th year, or because it grew more because it rained now in the 7th year in Shemitah? Is this from the 7th year? So if you see these leaves and they're like darkish green, shchayrin doesn't mamish literally mean black, but it means like darker, very dark green leaves, so then asurin. That's a sign that it grew additionally from the 7th year, from the soil, from the earth in the 7th year, and therefore it will be aser. Hayriku, however, if it's more green, and the lashon of hirik here in the Gemara means light green, it's more like yellowish, so it's not such dark green, so then mutarin. So then it'll be mutter, because what that means is that these leaves are not growing from the ground of the Shemitah year, but it's growing from the onions, which are from the 6th year, and therefore it's more yellowish leaves, because it's just getting its nourishment from the onions of the 6th year, not getting it from the ground of the 7th year of Shemitah. So that's a sign to see if these leaves are growing from the 6th year or the leaves are growing from the ground of the 7th year. Reb Chananya ben Antignas gives another sign. If when you pull on these leaves, it's going to pull out the whole onion as well. So then that shows that it's strong, that the onion is very strongly connected to these onions. So that's a sign that it grew stronger, and therefore it grew from the earth in the 7th year. So asurin. So it'll be aser. But when you pull the leaves, it's soft and it just tears off. So then it's a sign that it did not grow from the ground in the 7th year, and it'll be mutter. You know that it's just growing from these onions that are from the 6th year. Okay, so that's the beginning of this Mishnah. So again, it's speaking about the onions that began growing in the 6th year and it continues growing in the 7th year. But then the Mishnah there concludes and says the same halacha will apply when it comes to the onions that began growing in Shemitah and it continues growing into Matzah Shvius, meaning into the year following Shemitah, into the 8th year. Mutarin, that over here, if you pull on these leaves and the leaves are strong enough, Or if the leaves are dark enough, according to the Tanakama, and you can see that it grew in the 8th year, so because it continued growing in the 8th year, so therefore now you have the growth of the 8th year that will be mevatel, the iser of the 7th year. So you know that it's going to be mutter. These leaves that itself, that grew now in the 8th year, are going to be mutter. And also, if it's enough to be mevatel, the bulb or the onions that grew in the 7th year, it'll be mevatel that as well, mutarin. So what do you see over here in this Mishnah? In this Mishnah, it's talking about both in the case l'kula and in the case l'chumre. It's talking about what grew in the 6th year, coming into the 7th year, and therefore the growth of the 7th year will be a chumre to asa what grew in the 6th year. But it also says the reverse. It's talking about what grew in the 7th year, going out into the 8th year, and then what grew in the 8th year to be mekel, to say that it's already going to be mutter. Says the Gemara, lememre, so this Mishnah is clearly coming and telling you, the gidule heter mailen iser, that what grows in the 8th year, which the Mishnah calls matzah shvius, so that will be maila the iser, that will be mater the iser of what grew in the 7th year. So I clearly see over here that what grows is going to be mater the iser of the 7th year. So this resolves the question of Yishmolish Kfar Yama, clear Mishnah. So the Gemara says, but not necessarily is there a raya from here. Vidilme, perhaps this person that's planting his onions or his garlic in the 7th year, so he wants it to be mutter to eat in the 8th year. So what does he do? He doesn't just plant them as like bulbs, like full. What does he do? Vidilme, perhaps b'meduchanin. What he does is he crushes these garlic or onions, so it's not whole anymore, and that's how he plants it in the ground. So maybe in such a case, because he crushed it, so therefore now when it grows in the 8th year, it's not going to be, it's not anymore a growth that comes out of the onions or the garlic as is, but they were already crushed. And therefore what grows out of it will be mutter. Maybe if the onions that you planted were whole and you planted them whole in the ground, then I say that the growth that comes out of it is coming from a whole onion that came from Shemitah. And that was the question of Yishmael. In such a case, will this growth be mutter or aser? So maybe over here, adarabah, this is a different kind of a case. The person wants it to be mutter, so what does he do? He crushes it before he plants it in the ground.
It's a nice material.
Ella, says the Gemara, minado, so we don't have a raya from here. So rather, where do we have a raya from? Minado de Tanya. We have a raya from the following brisa. So the Gemara brings a different brisa that talks about this kind of halacha regarding Shemitah. But the brisa actually starts with halacha that's not related to Shemitah. And the brisa says, hamenachish imakuti b'chasiyais. If a person is weeding his plants together with a kuti. So a kuti is someone that, as we know, the kuti, they were Megayer, but they did not keep Torah mitzvahs properly. According to some opinions, they're not even proper gadim. So you're with a kuti in his field, and he's being menachish, he's weeding, taking off some of the extra leaves of the produce he has in the field. B'chasiyais. Chasiyais is these type of produce, as the Gemara will soon explain, these type of produce that when you plant them, it's not seeds that rot in the ground, but you're planting them like the onions and garlic, and you plant them and it's bulbs that remain there in the ground. So you were weeding these leaves. So oichol mehen achilas ara. You're allowed to eat from these leaves that you're taking off temporarily, and you don't have to give meiser before you eat from them. So this is the halacha when you get to meiser b'chlal, that if you're eating in the field before it's brought into the home, you're allowed to eat temporarily. And the point here is, we're not going to be chayshish that this kuti went and took the onions that were chayiv in meiser, and he did not give meiser for them, and he planted them, and it grew from them. You're not chayshish for that, and therefore you're allowed to eat from it b'derech aray. Umaisron vadai. And also, if you're taking meiser of these leaves that you took off here, you have to give meiser from it, and it's definitely chayiv in meiser. Meaning, we know for sure that this kuti did not yet take meisers from this produce that grew over here. So therefore, you're going to have to give meisers from it. Now, the brisa continues with another halacha which is related to Shemitah. Rab Shimon ben Elazar says, Im Yisrael chashod ala shvius. If there's a Yid that has a property and he's a person that you suspect him for not keeping Shemitah. So it could be he planted during Shemitah. Now, l'matzah shvius, but the produce of his field that he may have planted in Shemitah, but when it comes to the next year, to the 8th year after Shemitah, mutter. You're allowed to eat from the produce of his field. So what do you see from here? It began growing in Shemitah, but now it continued growing into the 8th year. So the growth of the 8th year will be mevatel what it began growing in the 7th year. So again, the Gemara says, "Lememre." So this Mishnah here, or this Braisa here, comes and proves to you and tells you the point. The Gidulei hata Maila Neseiser. What grows in the year, the 8th year, which is Mutter, will be Maila, will be Matter, the Isser of what grew in the 7th year. Okay, so that's what I see over here, a clear ayah to this point that the Yishmael asked, and here it's specifically talking about going out into the 8th year, and it's L'kula, it's going to be Matter, the growth of the 8th year is Matter, the 7th year. Says the Gemara, now the Gemara is going to try all kinds of ways to refute this raya. Vidilma, but maybe over here, how do you know it's talking about a person that planted such kind of things that are bulbs, that are left in the ground, and it grows from it? Maybe we're talking about a person that planted seeds in the ground in the 7th year, and it rots in the ground. Vidilma bedava shazare kala. Maybe we're talking about something that you're planting the seeds in the ground, and the seeds rot in the ground, and then from it grew into the 8th year, new leaves, new produce, but it's not that the bulbs remain in the ground, so it's not connected at all to the question that Yishmael was asking. He was speaking about something that the bulbs of what you planted remain in the ground. Says the Gemara, that can't be, because Hatanya, we learned in a Braise that explains what it says over here in this Braise. And what was the lashon of the Braise? Chasiyos, that he was weeding these chasiyos. What are these chasiyos? So the Braise says, Elu hein chasiyos, Kagayin haluf, v'ashum, v'abetzalim. There are specifically these kinds of vegetables. Luf, what's the translation of luf? I don't have the translation of luf. What do they say over here? They give a translation
member of the onion family.
Okay, some kind of an onion. Shum is garlic, and betzalim is onions. So it clearly says that it's speaking about things that you plant them, they're bulbs that remain in the ground. So the Gemara asks, another question. Before, what did we say when we wanted to refute this raya? So we said maybe the person, before he planted it, he didn't want it to be asr in the 8th year, so what did he do? He crushed it before he planted it. Says the Gemara, but vidilme bimeduchanen. But maybe when it was planted in the ground, it was crushed, and then it grows in the 8th year, so it's not coming from a whole thing that there is in the 7th year, so therefore now what grows is going to be mutter. So the Gemara says, well, over here in this Braisa, it doesn't make sense to say that he crushed it before he put it in the ground. Why? Because what did the Braisa say we're speaking about? Choshud ala shvi'is katani. We're talking about a yid that owns a property, and we suspect him of not keeping Shemitah. If the point is we're speaking about a person that we suspect of not keeping Shemitah, why would he crush it before he puts it into the ground? This is a person that we're afraid that he doesn't keep Shemitah, and he plants during Shemitah. He's not crushing it in order that it should be mutter in the 8th year. And on that itself it says that if it grows into the 8th year, it's mutter. The Gemara tries one more way to, that shouldn't be a raya from here. Says the Gemara, but vidilme, maybe the pshat, and what Rab Shimon ben Elazar said over here is, bitaruvas. Maybe what it's saying over here is that what grew from the 7th year into the 8th year, if it got mixed with other produce in the field that was planted in the 8th year, so then I say that it's going to be mutter. Only if it got mixed, but not the gidul itself, what grows in the 8th year, is not going to be matter what began growing in the 7th year. But the Gemara doesn't accept this either. The Gemara says, Hamanachish katani. It doesn't say in the Mishnah anything about a person that had a mixture with other things that grew from the 8th year. The first thing in the Mishnah, the Braisa rather, it started talking about Menachish. He's weeding these produce in his field. So therefore, basically, we have a clear raya from this Mishnah regarding the produce that started growing in the 7th year. It was planted in the 7th year, full bulbs that were planted in the 7th year, grows out into the 8th year, that the growth will be matter, what began growing, what was planted rather, in the 7th year. Okay, so now the Gemara comes back and says, if so, shall we say, Tavit Yufte, the Rabbi Yechanan. So this should refute what Rabbi Yechanan said, or the Rabbi Yonasan, what Rabbi Yonasan said. The Gemara brought before on Daf Nun Zayin that Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Yonasan also spoke about this halacha. When you have something that began with Isser, and then it grows more heter of it. The Gemara before spoke about whether this is regarding Arla. Rabbi Yechanan spoke about Arla, when you grafted an Arla tree into a tree that's not Arla. Rabbi Yonasan spoke about something that began growing in Klayim, and then it continued growing after you uprooted the vineyard, and it's not Klayim anymore. And both Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Yonasan said that even if it continues growing more, and it grows enough to be Mevatel the Isser, it will not be Mevatel the Isser. The Isser remains. So seemingly, what we just proved from this Braisa here refutes Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Yonasan's opinion. Here we're saying that what grows from Shemitah into the 8th year will nullify the Isser of the 7th year. So the Gemara answers, Shanya Shvi'is, Shemitah is a different story. Why? Hayel v'isura al yedei karka. What's the source of the Isser of Shemitah? The source of the Isser of Shemitah is the ground itself. That the Eibusher says the ground has to rest in this year, and you can't plant anything that's going to grow from the ground in this year will be Asr because of Shemitah. So since this is an Isser that comes from the actual ground itself, bitei lasa nami al yedei karka. So therefore the way to be mevatel the Isser is also when it grows from the ground in the 8th year. What grows in the ground of the 8th year, because in the 8th year the ground is mutter to be used, so the growth, where is it growing from? It's growing from the soil of the ground in the 8th year. So just like the Isser is caused by the ground that it grows from in the 7th year, so too when it continues growing into the 8th year, so now it's growing from the soil of the 8th year, that growth is a growth of Heter, which will be Mevatel the Isser. As opposed to Arla or Klaya Kerem, the Isser of Arla is not an Isser that's just because of the soil of the ground. It's because of the timing of 3 years. The Torah says it's not that the ground itself causes the Isser, that the ground itself is totally mutter. It's the tree in the time period of the 3 years that the Torah says becomes Asabah No. So because it's not the ground that's causing the Isser, and the same thing by Klaya Kerem, it's not the actual ground that's causing the Isser. What's causing the Isser? The mixture of the vineyard with the vegetables. So over there, the fact that it continues growing afterwards when there's no Arla, or continues growing when there's no Klayim, you can't say that the ground that it grows from causes a Heter. So therefore over there, the Gidul could still be Asr. That's what Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yechanan said. Okay, the Gemara over here now brings a question on this. Fragt the Gemara, but Harei Meiser, how about the halachas of Meiser? What causes the chiyuv of Meiser? The chiyuv of Meiser is not caused by anything. It's just whatever produce grows from the ground. Produce growing from the ground, you have to give Meiser from it. The Isura al yedei karka, so the Isser of Meiser. In other words, the Isser to eat it before you take Meiser. This comes from the ground itself. And ve'em b'telos al yedei karka. But here the Gemara will now bring a braisa that you see that even if it continues growing, it will not, the continued growth, in a way that it's mutter, as we'll see here in the Braisa what that case is. So even though it's an Isser that comes from the ground, when it continues growing, it will not be Mevatel this Isser. So where do we see this? The Braisa says, the Tanya, Litra Meiser. You took a certain measurement of produce that is Meiser. Litra Meiser Tevel rather. Okay, a liter of Meiser Tevel, meaning that this is a produce that he did not give Meiser from it yet. And he went, Shezara Bekarka, he planted it. So this grew in the 6th year, and he went and planted it in the ground, and it now continued. When did it grow? It grew in the 7th year, which is the Shemitah year. V'hishbicha, and it continued growing much more than what it originally was. V'harehi ke'eser litrin. So let's say you planted a bulb of an onion in the ground, and it grew from it 10 times as much. And now it's 9 times against what you planted in the ground. Now it's 10 litrin. So what's the halacha? Chayeves b'meiser. That original onion that you planted in the ground that was chayev and meiser is still chayev and meiser. That doesn't change. It grew more from it, and it grew 9 times against it. It grew enough to be mevatlet b'roiv. Doesn't matter. The growth that grows from it is not mevatlet b'roiv. Ubishvius, but this that grew now is also going to be chayiv and shmita. Why? Because so much of it grew now in the year of shmita, so it's going to be chayiv in shmita. V'oisa litra. Now that original amount, that onion that you planted in the ground, that was so it was chayiv and meiser. So ma'aser aleh memokem acher lefi cheshbon. You're gonna have to take meisers on it from another place. In other words, from another produce that grew in the 6th year. You can't take meisers from it. Usually, how do you take meisers from the produce? You take meisers from this actual produce itself that you planted. But over here, you can't take meisers from this produce itself that you planted. Why not? Because only that first original amount that you planted in the ground is chayiv meisers. The additional amount that grew in Shemitah is not chayiv meisers b'chlal. Shemitah, there is no meisers. So therefore you can't give meisers from this produce on that original amount that you planted. So where are you going to give the meisers from? From other produce from the previous year, from the 6th year. So again, so what do you see clearly over here? If something was chayiv and meisers, and you did not take the meisers from it, and you just went, you took that onion, and you replanted it in the ground, that chiyuv of meisers that it has, even though now in the year Shemitah it's going to grow much more from it, and l'chayre the growth that it grew, we just proved, should be mevatel, the original amount. Why? Because the chiyuv of meisers comes from the ground. Chiyuv of Maasros doesn't come from anything else. Whatever grows from the ground. So if it grows more, and now it grew more when? In the year Shemitah, and in the year Shemitah there's no Maasros, it should be mevatel, the original amount that you planted from the 6th year that was chayiv and Maasros. And we say over here that it's not mevatel, the original amount that was chayiv and Maasros. So the Gemara answers, Maaser is also something that its chiyuv is not just from the fact that it grows from the soil of the ground. It's not like Shemitah. Shemitah is specifically a Isser that's in the ground. That's what causes the Torah wants the ground to rest. But Maaser is different. Omri, they answered, Maaser, when it comes to Maaser, Digun hu dekok godim lei. The chiyuv of Maaser and the produce in the field, what causes the chiyuv when you take out the dogon from the ground, or you take out the grain and you make a pile of all the kernels of the grain, that's when the chiyuv of Maaser comes. So what you see is, it's not the actual growth of the ground that creates the chiyuv of Maaser, but there's an additional step. You have to make a pile out of it, and that's when the chiyuv of Maaser comes. So because the chiyuv of Maaser does not come from the ground, so the additional growth that would be mevatel it is not mevatel it. So therefore, it's not compared to Shemitah, where the whole entire Is of Shemitah just comes from the ground itself.